Of course, all of this talk around the GP co-payment, the fact that it has been shelved, it is very interesting. And one of the points which was designed basically to sweeten the deal, I suspect, was this medical research fund. Now, it was obviously somebody's idea that we can sweeten the bitter pill of the GP co-payment. The problem being, of course, it runs totally counter to their claims of a budget emergency, because if you are facing a genuine fiscal crisis, well, you don't have spare cash to set up a fund for a rainy day, do you? Just pay off the debt. That's what you're elected to do, not to potentially establish new pots of money for Labor to waste at some point in the future. And so I think that was error number one. Is the policy savable? Should it go to an election? Terry Barnes is a former advisor to Tony Abbott when he was the health minister. He was the author of the original idea around all of this, but of course it's been amended quite heavily since then. And Terry Barnes is on the line. Terry, good morning.
Good morning, Stuart.
Thank you for your time. It's certainly been heavily politicised. When you hear what Peter Dutton, the health minister, had to say this morning, he shelved it for the time being. Do you think that's the end of it in this term of Parliament, or do you think there is a way back?
Well, I didn't quite read that he shelved it. I think he basically kept the idea and the principle open, which I think is, from my point of view, is the way to go. I think the budget proposal, as it was put forward, is basically dead in the water. It probably has been dead for some time. But the idea of having a co-payment or a price signal on going to the doctor, I think, is very important. And, the government shouldn't walk away from that principle without at least some fight in the Senate.
I'll give you an example here. This is one of my emailers, June. She says, if the co-payment was introduced with my recent illness, visits to doctors, specialist tests, etc., I wouldn't be able to afford to buy the medication they prescribed anyway, so we'd just give up and sit at home and hope for the best. Let Abbott cut down on that very generous paid parental leave scheme, also with the hefty tax breaks for people who can afford to put thousands into their superannuation funds where the average worker can't. Reports say Tony Abbott has made a name for himself on the world stage, but not locally. If it weren't for the plane disasters, he'd be in real strife. He really chickened out with Russian President Putin after all his big talk. For those with chronic illnesses and chronic diseases, there was some exemption under the GP co-payment anyway, wasn't there?
Well, that's exactly right, Stuart, and I think your listener and her concerns actually reflect that maybe the government hasn't sold the package as well as it could have and explained the reasons why it needs to be done. Because certainly in my original proposal and in their version, there was a safety net to ensure that nobody would be out of pocket more than, in the government's case, $70 in a year. And in terms of specialists, they're not actually covered by this GP co-payment proposal at all.
Anyway, that's right, yeah.
But I think the point here, Stuart, is that there's a bit of hypocrisy going on in the medical profession, the AMA, about this, because specialists basically are free to charge patients what they like,
yes,
whether it's through their health insurer or directly. And usually if you go to the specialist, particularly for a first visit, it's a way more than $7 that you're out of pocket.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. And that's when you can finally get in to see the specialist, Terry.
That's exactly right. So
yeah,
there's a lot of distortion and misrepresentation in all of this. And the government's proposal itself was probably a bit too complicated. It had unintended consequences, including the fact that it covers radiology and pathology as well as GP services. So if you go to the GP and refer for an X-ray or a pathology test or whatever, and you go back to the GP, that's co-payment after co-payment, and there's a problem there. But you can make it simpler, you can make it cleaner, and you can make it fairer. And I think the government still has the opportunity to do that before the co-payment's due to start on the 1st of July next year. And I think they should look at simplifying it rather than simply dumping it.
What about the idea that this is a fairly radical departure from what we've known? There was no mention of it during the election campaign. Is it a big enough policy that it is something like John Howard did with the GST in 1998, something that should be taken to an election?
Well, that's a very good question. I think the government could see it as a mandate issue, but I think it's perfectly reasonable for the government to actually legislate before an election and be prepared to stand or fall on it. So I would like to see the government to actually see this through, at least in some way.
Yes.
If it's voted down in the Senate and they want to take it to an election after that, that's probably a better option for them politically than to simply cave into the Senate. Don't put something up, and next time the crossbenchers, Labor and the Greens, will feel even more determined.
That's exactly right. Look, I agree with you. I think there's some merit in saying, well, look, maybe on this occasion the Senate's done us a favour. We'll dust ourselves off. We'll reset our arguments on all of this, because I think there are some sound arguments for those with a capacity to pay. I'd be exempting pensioners from the start. I wouldn't necessarily just be saying, well, those with chronic diseases and others. I think those who have got a capacity to pay, you'd say, well, look, fair enough, and then be prepared to discuss and debate the merits of that campaign during an election, and then people at least go in knowing what they're going to get, because as it is, we were told no tax increases, no new taxes, and suddenly now this potentially being thrust upon us when it is effectively a new tax on visits to the doctor.
Well, I don't see it as tax at all. It's a charge, it's a price signal. But I mean, we could argue about.
I know. Look, that's one of those semantic debates. But bottom line is, it's going to be $7 that isn't in my pocket today that was in my pocket yesterday.
Yes, but we all make choices about how we spend $7 in our pockets, Stuart, and some of them are not necessarily as good for you.
Agree. No, I agree with that.
Keep that in mind as well.
Yeah.
And that's the whole point. I think the problem with Medicare, or the problem with going to the doctor generally, and including your GP, is that when it's bulk billed, you don't actually see that coming from your wallet, and you don't necessarily value the service as highly as you would if you're actually making at least a nominal contribution to it. So a price signal basically helps people value what they're getting, but also helps them to ask the question, do I really need to go to the GP just now? Are there other ways of dealing with what I've got or what my kids have got? I mean, it's actually asking people to place more value on the services they're receiving.
That's right.
Actually a good thing.
Yeah, and look, I agree with you. It's a world-class health system, and obviously those who are involved in it, they've gone through years and years of university study, training, all of those sorts of things. Agree wholeheartedly with that. I just wonder why we didn't hear those arguments from Peter Dutton, Joe Hockey and Tony Abbott before the last election.
Well, I think when you're in government dealing with a tough budgetary situation, you have to deal with the facts in front of you as you have them in government. So you don't get the access to the books in opposition that you'd like, even in an election campaign. But having said that, I mean, once they've made a decision to go ahead, they need to explain and bring the public along with them. And maybe just in this case, they've not succeeded. But the opponents of the co-payment, the opponents of the principle, are basically so bloody-minded and ideological and so powerful, particularly in the case of the Australian Medical Association, that it's a very tough fight to take on if you're not ready. And I think in this case, the government, if it had its time again, might have approached it a little differently.
Well, perhaps an election campaign may have readied them for the battle, Terry. Look, appreciate your time this morning.
Pleasure, Stuart.
Good to chat with you. Thank you. Terry Barnes, a former advisor to Tony Abbott when he was the Health Minister. His thoughts on all of that. It is pretty simple to me. It is a revolutionary change to the way we do things, and I've got no problem with the idea of a price signal, none at all. But it's the sort of debate that you'd expect to have during an election campaign. And then we go into it knowing what we are voting for. No problem with placing a greater importance, a greater value on medical services. No problem me if every time I go to the doctor I have to pay $7. That's fine. I waste plenty of other money on a variety of different things. But you've got to be upfront with this stuff, and you've got to make the case. And I think that's the important thing. And we've seen this with successful political leaders. We saw it with Bob Hawke. We saw it with Paul Keating. We saw it with John Howard. We saw it with John Key, who's just been re-elected with an even bigger majority in New Zealand, where he's introduced a number of radical proposals over the past couple of years, including an increase in the GST, and he's been able to win those debates. And so it does show you that if you are prepared to put the hard yards in, do the explaining, the debating, bring the people with you during an election campaign, you do come out of it on the other side. And I know at times we get caught up in these scare campaigns, ridiculous arguments go back and forwards, but it doesn't mean that someone shouldn't be able to rise above all of this nonsense. They can. And the idea that somehow that Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey were blind to what was going on, can I just remind you a little bit of recent history? Obviously, just towards the latter part of 2012, when we had the change that played out, 2011, the change that played out, obviously with the situation where suddenly there was a change. Julia Gillard lost, Kevin Rudd took over, and then there was a mini budget not long after that from the new Treasurer, Chris Bowen. Now, at that point, Treasury updated where the budget was. Not long after that, of course, Kevin Rudd went to the election, and the election was called. 2013, won, Tony Abbott. 10 days into the election, both sides knew exactly the state of the books. And so this idea that suddenly the budget blew out from $30 billion to $50 billion and they didn't know is rubbish. because they were both working off exactly the same set of figures provided by Treasury. 21 past 10, we'll update our news headlines. Steve Blandy, good morning.